His talk presented the analogy of Darwin with his professor in the glacial valley looking for fossils, and that Darwin needed a new theory, a new point of view, that he could not see what was around him. Well, I'm going to talk today about a model. I'm going to talk today about two models. I'm going to talk about a traditional mental health model, and I'm going to talk about an alternative evolutionary model for thinking about risky adolescent behavior. And I do not want to suggest that the mental health model is anything like Darwin in the glacial valley looking for fossils that weren't there. That's not my implication here, because the mental health model has provided many truths and has advanced the science in many ways. But I do want to suggest that, like Darwin in the valley, that the mental health model in and of itself, without a broader evolutionary perspective, has led practitioners to miss some very important things and to miss seeing some important truths that are out there. And that I think that that kind of mental health thinking can be importantly expanded by bringing in an evolutionary perspective. So today we're going to try to think outside the box of mental health. Many of you, probably all of you, saw the recent news stories about the horrific murder in Chicago. Unfortunately, we don't have to go to last month to have a horrific event. We had one this last week in the terrible events in Richmond, California. And when you see these events, and in the Chicago case, I'm going to talk a little bit about that Chicago case. This was exceptional, not because it's unusual that a teenager got caught up in a gang fight and was murdered, but this was unusual because someone caught it on a cell phone video and posted it on the web, and it was viewed millions of times by millions of people. And this terrible murder is really an extreme example of what you might refer to as the problem of adolescent risk behavior. And you might think of it as being symptomatic of a pervasive and costly problem, which are often encompass such things as substance abuse, risky sexual behavior, exploitive personal relationships, violence, the general package of things that we think about consisting of adolescent risk behavior. And there are, in our own community and throughout the United States and throughout the world, there are extensive intervention prevention efforts to try to prevent or reduce these activities. And I think we would all agree that while these efforts have had some usefulness, they've also had limited effects, and the problems are still quite pervasive. Now, the mental health model, to kind of sum up, the basic idea of it, is that it's the idea that high-risk environments, dangerous, adverse environments, adversely affect children's well-being, and that they, in fact, promote disturbances in development. And so from a kind of standard mental health perspective, the focuses are on the destructive effects of such things as dysfunctional families and harsh social ecologies on mental health outcomes. So in short, what's often thought of as being dysfunctional behavior in adolescence, and typically used, in mental health writing, I don't think that there's any, I think it's fairly explicit that there's a value judgment put on our behaviors. There are behaviors that are considered good and behaviors that are considered bad. There are good family environments, there are dysfunctional family environments, there are dysfunctional patterns of behavior. And then from this perspective, the focus on dysfunctional behavior in childhood and adolescence is seen as a natural consequence or outcome of exposure to harsh, unpredictable, or uncontrollable conditions. The essential idea is that all the bad stuff goes together. The more adversity, the more difficulty, the more risk factors that you're exposed to, the more it will disturb or perturb your development, resulting in, from a societal perspective, negative, bad health outcomes, bad behavioral outcomes. Okay, now let's try to look at this same question from a different perspective. And I'll just say that I'm going to present this in this talk, but also when A.J. Figueiredo speaks and when Jay Belsky speaks, they're also going to discuss some of these same questions. The evolutionary model, risky behaviors, so in a sense, when you're talking about what are adolescents doing when they're actually engaging in so-called risky behaviors, from this perspective, risky behaviors reflect adaptations to risky environments. And in a sense, these are not just deviations from optimal development. From an evolutionary perspective, stressful environments difficult environments have always been part of the human experience. And in fact, when you look at hunter-gatherer societies, 50% of children die before they reach adulthood. We've always lived in harsh, adverse environments. Encountering a stressful, so from this perspective, encountering stressful environments, what it does is that it directs or regulates development towards social strategies that are adaptive under stressful conditions, even if those strategies are currently harmful or appear to be harmful. After that terrible murder in Chicago, naturally, journalists went into the area and interviewed kids in the neighborhoods. And just some of those quotes from the kids that were there, from the kids that were around this, are indicative of how kids' own assessments of what was going on reflect their perceptions of how they adapt to the environment or what they have to do to survive in this kind of dangerous context. A couple of quotes. Yeah, we fight. Every kid fights. I like this next one. Teenagers who have very little are willing to fight over very little. It can escalate from being with a girl. It can escalate from it can escalate from somebody saying something, somebody looking at somebody wrong. He said, she said. It can start from any and everything. One of the things that evolutionary psychologists often talk about is the young male syndrome. How males that have, as this quote expresses, who have very little are willing to fight over very little. How being in situations with few resources often leads to high-risk strategies or willing to go for the long odds. Another quote from one of the residents in this neighborhood. Males in particular need to appear tough. In some situations, it's good to be bigger. It's good to be the bigger man and walk off. But in some situations, you can't be the bigger man and walk off, because if a person provokes you to a certain extent, you're going to do what you got to do, defend yourself. You ain't just going to run. Okay, so again, from the perspective of people growing up in this context, they're developing survival strategies or strategies for dealing with this context, which are certainly, which you might think of as being appropriate to that context, or at least that would facilitate survival in that context. You could imagine if someone growing up in this situation was really taught to be trusting and open and have a secure attachment style and to have a cooperative interpersonal orientation, they might not get very far living in this neighborhood. Now, to understand adaptive development under stress, to understand alternative patterns of development, one can look at humans and one can try and observe what humans are doing, but it's also sometimes interesting to look at controlled animal studies because they help us really understand different patterns of development under different conditions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of Michael Meany's work on alternative patterns of development in rats. And this work really sheds light on how developmental pathways respond to stress in terms of how the whole organism, how the whole phenotype, the whole, the biology and the behavior of the organism really becomes adapted to different environments. Particularly in terms of matching, strategically matching the phenotype to the environment. Now, the nice thing about these studies is they really get around the problems of genetic confounds when you study humans, because with rats, you can cross-foster them at birth, so you can put rats, so you can essentially assign rats to different rearing conditions, which really controls for or breaks all the potential genetically confounded links. Okay, you don't need to read this this busy slide. I absolve you of that, but you might just want to focus on this arrow going down in the middle of it. And in this context, at the very top, actually, can I have that laser pointed out? At the very top of this slide is the ecological stressor. So this is a rat model. So the rat's ecology, the stress in the rat's ecology is represented by the cat. And the cat provides the particular high levels of stress. And so we see here the ecological stressors themselves, they affect the mother's reproductive and stress physiology. They affect, depending on the presence of such stressors, the parental generation is having different stress responses. They're showing different types of fear responses. So on the left here is a kind of a high stress context where rats are growing up in a high-stress ecology. In response to the mother's own reproductive and stress physiology, when she actually bears offspring, she tends to engage in a certain type of parenting behavior. So parenting behaviors themselves are matched to the ecology. So in these high-stress environmental contexts, the mothers tend to engage in relatively low levels of parental investment. They engage in low levels of licking and grooming and arch-back nursing, which is really the key indicators of parental investment in rats. Different types of nursing deliver different amounts of milk. Different types of licking and grooming regulate the pup's stress systems and gene expression in different ways. So in these high-stress conditions, the mothers are doing low levels of these things. In turn, this affects the gene expression in the offspring's brain. This affects their glucocorticoid receptor expression. It affects all kinds of mechanisms in terms of it's been mostly studied in the hippocampus and in their stress responses, but in a sense it is upregulating the rat's stress responses, and that in turn is affecting their behavior in various ways. So it doesn't really matter about the rat's genetics in this case, because no matter what kind of genetics the rats have, if they're cross-fostered and they're raised by this type of mother and they receive this type of parenting, they tend to, they're likely to show a certain type of stress response. They're likely to develop more defensive behaviors, to be more aware and vigilant against predators. They also tend to, interestingly enough, rats in this context, they tend to go through puberty earlier. So like in some human work, some of the work in my own research program, which suggests that stressful family environments are provoking earlier puberty. In humans, there's also experimental evidence that these same low levels of parental investment in stressful environments are also provoking earlier puberty in rats. This is, in turn, it's also leading to certain types of cognition. So the rats that are growing up under these high stress conditions, although their cognitive performance is maybe impaired under certain conditions, under high stress conditions, these rats show high memory and especially effective learning compared to the rats in the opposite condition. So thinking about adaptive development under stress, what is happening to these rats growing up under high stress adverse conditions with lots of what you might think of as risk factors? Well, they show enhanced learning under stressful conditions, increased fearful and defensive behaviors, accelerated sexual maturation, earlier onset and increased sexual behavior, and reduced parental investment in the next generation. Apparently, and that these changes in response to their environments apparently represent strategic, that is functional ways of developing when neglected. So this is very consistent with an evolutionary model of socialization, particularly here I refer readers to the Belsky, Steinberg, and Draper model, of which some versions of which were in the posted readings. So what does this tell us? What are the implications of this kind of thinking? All right, when we look at low levels of licking and grooming in the rat, what are those doing? Well, neglect itself in this context can be regarded as a mechanism that parents guide offspring toward optimal survival and reproductive strategies under adversity. And the diminished licking and grooming, in this case, you would not think of it as poor maternal care, and the development induced by it is not disturbed, but rather, from an evolutionary perspective, the care provided by the putatively neglectful parents is perhaps appropriate preparation of offspring for the ecological conditions in which they are likely to mature. Okay, so this is kind of a radical frame shift from the mental health model. This is really a different way of thinking about it. This is not about exposure to stress inducing dysfunctional behavior. This is about parental behavior itself responding to the environment, and that behavior itself structuring development in functional ways that are preparing the animal for the environment it's likely to grow up in ways that will promote its survival and perhaps its reproductive success. Okay, so again, thinking outside the box of mental health, what we think of as bad parenting, what we think of what in the mental health perspective might be thought of as harsh parenting or inconsistent parenting or insensitive parenting, directs or regulates child development towards strategies that are adaptive under stressful conditions, just as what we think of as good parenting, which I would put in quotation marks as well, high levels of investment and sensitivity, guides development towards strategies that are adaptive under stable, supportive conditions. And so this is really trying to, one of the frame shifts here is really moving beyond value judgments, really moving beyond what is good development or bad development, and thinking about adaptation in context. Okay, so applying this to humans, the child who responds to a dangerous social environment by developing an insecure attachment style or opportunistic interpersonal orientation or aggressive behavior or early sexual debut, that child is no less functional or more dysfunctional than a child who responds to a well-resourced and supportive environment by developing a secure attachment style or reciprocally rewarding interpersonal orientation or pro-social behavior or later sexual debut. And so you can kind of think of this by, one way to think about this is an analogy with taste buds. When you take a drink of sour milk and you have a kind of a negative reaction to it and you spit it out, are your taste buds operating any more functionally or less dysfunctionally than when you go out to El restaurant last night and you drink and you have a delicious meal and your taste buds tell you that's really good, I should be consuming it. Whether you're eating really good food or whether you're eating spoiled food, in both contexts, your taste buds are functioning as they should. And this is just an analogy of thinking about also how children's developmental mechanisms or in a sense developmental programs are responding to different types of environments structuring their own development. Now, one thing I want to communicate is that this model of adaptive development under stress, optimal adaptation from an evolutionary perspective to suboptimal environments is not without costs. And by that, harsh environments are, inflict a cost on people. Harsh environments often harm or kill children. As I mentioned, over human evolutionary history, half of children that were born died before they grew up. So harsh environments are pervasive. And so adaptation to harsh environments is really about making the best of a bad situation. It's not about getting ideal development. It's not that kids who are growing up in harsh environments are going to be able to have as good a health or as maximal developmental outcomes as kids who are well nourished, who have a lot of resources. Kids, exposure to resources and enriched environments allow you to achieve all kinds of developmental outcomes that you cannot achieve without that. But exposure to harsh, adverse environments are leading to systematic changes or systematic adjustments of development that are allowing you to deal with the situation that you're in systematic, predictable ways. Okay, well, this is just getting ahead of myself. Even the best strategy, even the best you can do in a harsh situation may represent, in a sense, may still represent a high-risk strategy. It's by no means without risk. Okay, so first off, thinking about, where does this perspective, at a first blush, where does this perspective take us in terms of implications for policy prevention for adolescents? Well, many people in this room and many people in a larger context are engaged in efforts to reduce the pain and suffering of children growing up under harsh or adverse environmental conditions. And I think that in structuring those efforts and thinking about those efforts, that you want to take into consideration the local sense in which risky and seemingly self-destructive behaviors are adaptive. There are powerful evolutionary forces at work that are leading kids to respond in certain ways to harsh environments, to engage in certain types of behaviors, to pursue certain strategies. And we need to understand, how the brain is designed to respond to these environments if we want to be really effective in designing strategies to counteract that. Okay. Moving back to the mental health model. One of the precepts of the mental health model is essentially, and this is widely seen in the developmental psychology literature, is that all the bad stuff goes together. This has names like problem behavior theory, for instance. And according to problem behavior theory and other similar theories, essentially cumulative childhood exposures to familial and ecological stressors, such as harsh parenting and deviant peers, add up to induce emotionally and behaviorally dysregulated psychological functioning in adolescence. So the more risk factors that you're exposed to, the more that it perturbs development, pushes development in a dysfunctional direction. And there's not a really clear distinction between the types of adversities that you're exposed to. When individuals develop interventions to try to reduce childhood behavioral problems, they often just try to cumulatively reduce those risk factors. So the most extensive intervention, the most long-term and extensive adolescent intervention going on right now, I believe, is the Fast Track Intervention Program. And this is a 10-year intervention with children. They start in first grade, it takes them through high school. And they just try, and it just tries to treat everything. It tries to, let's just, it's an across the board, let's try to reduce risk factors across the board. Now, that intervention costs about $60,000 per child. It's a lot of money for an intervention. And it may be paying off, but it's not really thinking, but interventions that think globally about all the bad stuff goes together and we just need to reduce the bad stuff, that may not be the most efficient method. From an evolutionary perspective, development adjusts itself in different ways to different kinds of environmental stressors. And I want to use an example from Barack Obama's book, Dreams from My Father. And in that book, I don't know if any of you read his early autobiography. It's quite a compelling book. He talks about his childhood in Indonesia. And he later talks about his experiences as a community organizer in Chicago, and particularly working around the Outgeld Gardens housing project, which is the very area where that recent murder took place. So he was direct. So interesting that our president, has a history of working right in that neighborhood where this terrible event took place. So he might have some insight into that. Okay, so in this book, he compares these two environments. He compares growing up in Indonesia to being in Chicago, and he writes, quote, I saw in those Jakarta markets, Jakarta, Indonesia, I saw those Jakarta markets for what they were, fragile, precious things. The people who sold their goods there might have been poorer even than the folks in Outgeld. They hauled 50 pounds of firewood on their back every day. They ate little, they died young. And yet for all that poverty, there remained in their lives a discernible order, a tapestry of trading routes and middlemen, bribes to pay and customs to observe, the habits of a generation played out every day. It was the absence of such coherence that made a place like Outgeld so desperate, I thought to myself. It was the loss of order. But also there was not a sense of order and predictability. People did not know what they were in for. And according to evolutionary models, organisms adjust to harsh and unpredictable environments in different ways. So, in a sense, when you think about the difference between these two, let's talk about environments that are harsh but predictable. So difficult environments. So in cross-cultural analyses, when you actually look at small-scale human societies, you often find that harsh ecologies, difficult ecologies are associated with father presence. They're associated with comparatively high levels of biparental care of children. And presumably it's because high levels of maternal and paternal investment are needed to ensure child survival in this context. When resources are scarce, when life is harsh but predictable and two parents can make a difference, two parents tend to invest relatively heavily. And in fact, predictably harsh conditions may promote harsh parenting, may promote what we think of as authoritarian parenting, not because such environments undermine the ability of, undermine parental effort, but because it's important for parents to firmly control their children's behavior in environments that are marked by high levels of threat, but from predictable sources. By contrast, in unpredictable environments, there's not much that parents can do to protect their kids. There's not a lot that they can do to promote the health and survival of their children, and it's really in harsh, unpredictable environments that we expect to find really the most high-risk behavior among the children and the most risky behavior among the parents as well. It's very different what you'd expect in Outgeld from what you'd expect in Jakarta. At least in the Jakarta that Barack Obama described in his childhood. Okay, so in terms of implications for policy and prevention for adolescents, a key factor may be reducing unpredictability of adolescent environments. And an example of this is the Oregon Social Learning Program for juvenile offenders. So one intervention program, not that this was specifically informed by an evolutionary perspective, but they're doing what an evolutionary perspective would suggest, and that is this program specifically designed, the entire program is designed to produce a predictable and contingent environment for adolescents. And so they're working with children who are from the worst backgrounds. They're all children that have mandated out-of-home care. And in this context, they're randomly assigned to group care as usual or this Oregon Social Learning Center intervention. And in the OSLC, I mean, it is based in behaviorism, but what they're doing is essentially, they're using tokens and using chips, and they're making everything the kid does predictable and contingent. And they're creating an environment where the kid knows exactly what's going to happen and when. And this program has been remarkably effective at reducing teen pregnancy. Even though kids in the control condition have more, even though girls in the control condition have more access to males, even though kids in the control condition are much more tightly monitored because they're in group homes and they don't have access to males, groups in this condition I'm not articulating this very well, but kids in the treatment condition who are receiving the program from the OSLC, these girls have a lot more chances to interact with males, a lot more chances to get pregnant, and yet they have pregnancy rates that are about 50% lower. And so just a simple lesson from this is it may not be, you may not want to put all these pieces together. You may want to separate out harsh from predictable environments and thinking about the differences in how kids respond to those contexts. Further, a pervasive belief that people, in a sense, thinking about, what really underlies risky behavior. From an evolutionary perspective, it's a pervasive belief that people are unpredictable, that the future is uncertain, that the world is chaotic. And this should be a fundamental intervening mechanism that orients adolescents towards the here and now and increases risk-taking behavior. So this belief that the world cannot be predicted as uncertain is something that should be fundamental to thinking about structuring adolescent policy and fundamental to thinking about adolescent risk behavior. Okay, so in conclusion, from an evolutionary perspective, the developing brain is designed to detect and respond to particular features of childhood environments, features that have proven reliable over evolutionary time in predicting the nature of the social and physical world into which children will mature. And different types of exposures function to regulate alternative patterns of development that reliably match children to those features. So what the implication of perspective is that we need to understand those structured relations between the developing brain and developmental environments, such as how the brain responds to unpredictability, to really develop effective policy and prevention for adolescents. Finally, just as an acknowledgement, many of these ideas I presented today are from a paper that is currently in process that is in collaboration with several co-authors, including Jay Belsky in this room here. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take questions. I think we could probably take a couple of questions before.
Right.
Yeah, Jay.
I think this is one of the challenges we're going to face. And on the one hand, the argument is that looking at the world, looking at adolescent risk behavior through evolutionary lenses is going to provide some insight to give us some new avenues of intervention, among other things. On the other hand, you show us the OLS intervention program, which is about as ignorant of evolutionary perspective as you can be. And they're doing just fine and dandy, thank you. So I think one of the challenges is going to come again and again is not can we reframe the issue in an evolutionary perspective, but what is the fundamental added value? And I think it's easy to claim that there is, and I have, in the abstract, an added value. But actually carrying that through and say, no, this is what we should be doing instead of that. Or this is why that's not going to work because it's too minor. And I just want to juxtapose making a theoretical argument and really then demonstrating that there's an added value there, not just an alternative way of explaining things.
Well, I mean, one of the things is that this is like running an experiment, right? And so what's great is that very often, especially when you do, let's throw in everything in the kitchen sink and make everything right, and you're spending $60,000 on a kit where we could actually predict that giving the family $60,000 would
Do the trick.
do a whole lot. I mean, Jane Costello has demonstrated that. But what you can do is say, what are the key ingredients? I mean, you went through that, and there was a whole lot of complexity that went away, and you're setting up a series of hypotheses about these are the key ingredients about what may make this successful. And so one, at least in theory, could say, we can help be cost effective in producing predictable, more reliable results because we understand the mechanisms, which is way more interesting because then it may work in Oregon, it may not work in Chicago, right? And if we don't understand why, then that's one thought.
Yeah, Richard.
Richard Wall, I'm a adolescent medicine pediatrician and work of adolescent medicine programs in Tucson. And one of my sites is Pima County Juvenile Detention, working with these kids. 80% of them have a DSM psychiatric diagnosis, non-substance abuse. 90% have a substance abuse diagnosis. And trying to reverse that around, is there an advantage to these kids of some of these behaviors that earn them a psychiatric diagnosis? The one that comes to my mind is, and I am ignorant of the evolutionary literature, this is all brand new to me, but attention deficit disorder is something that is, the diagnosis of that has exploded. The medical treatment for it has exploded, and the expenditures on medications has exploded. Well, is there an advantage to this unfiltered awareness of your environment and letting all stimuli in and not focusing on specific things? And in an environment where there's either a saber-toothed tiger over there or a kid with a baseball bat over there may be a significant advantage to an unfiltered awareness of everything. And that's what we call attention deficit disorder.
Right, right.
So, I mean, that's one of those things that have occurred to me in the past, ways to look at this, that there may be an adaptive aspect for these kids of some of their psychiatric diagnoses that we are trying to treat.
You bring, I'm just going to respond to this before I take a couple more
And
questions.
we might, to keep on schedule, we do have a long Q&A, long period to discuss all of this. So just to keep on schedule, we want to, we're supposed to have a break from 10 to 10:15, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
Perhaps we should just maybe answer this question, take a little break, and then move on, and people will save some of their remarks for the general question and answer. You brought up a whole bunch of issues. One of the things that an evolutionary perspective brings is an explicit focus on how our world has changed in ways that we may not fit, where we've created environments that may not be compatible with how the brain is designed. In our education or childhood education workshop,
just the focus on, one of the things that was brought up is that kids sit still in chairs. ADHD kids can't sit still in chairs very well. And just, keeping kids physically constrained, isolating them with other kids their same age, it has all these effects that we may not be thinking of. And one of the points that I was making in this talk today is that, yeah, we have these DSM diagnoses, but from an evolutionary perspective, what in the medical community is diagnosed as disorders, may not really be disorders. That, they may, in a sense, represent conditional adaptations in certain types of environmental contexts. A lot of these kids growing up in these dangerous Chicago neighborhoods, maybe most of them would be diagnosed with conduct disorder. But but thinking about what that's doing. Now, I think the bigger question is, I kind of want to come back also to Jay's question, which is, well, what is the value of thinking about that? Okay, we can make that claim. We can state that, well, in a harsh or unpredictable environment, it's going to enhance the kid's survival, or it's going to make sense to develop, a hostile attribution style and an aggressive interaction style, and to engage, to join a gang and do things. But what does it really get us to think about this from an evolutionary perspective? I think that it helps to understand, by taking it away from a dysfunction model towards an adaptive development model, I think it helps us better understand the mechanisms. And this is also the point that Carol was making in her response today. I think it helps us understand both, the motivational mechanisms and what are helps us understand structured relationships between children's environments and their development. And yes, okay, I gave an example of the of the Oregon Social Learning Center as an intervention that is consistent with a focus on unpredictability. Well, it's not going to be, there's many interventions out there, and some of them are going to be more consistent with an evolutionary approach than others, just as there's many alternative school environments. Some of them are going to be more in touch or more consistent with natural learning styles than others. But I would hope that an explicit focus on this would really allow us to pinpoint and get closer to effective strategies and effective ways of manipulating environments that will give kids better outcomes from a mental health perspective. Thank you. I'm going to...
I think we're